They don't ask for your permission. They don't announce the cage they are building around your mind. First, they soften the edges of your thoughts, unnoticed, like a shadow stretching across a room. Small suggestions, repeated images, subtle contradictions, each one a quiet erosion of your mental defenses. By the time you notice, your resistance is already a memory, and your choices are no longer entirely your own. This is not theory. It is a system, a hidden choreography of compliance most will never see. What they don't want you to realize is that awareness itself can be absorbed, bent, and redirected. You are about to witness the mechanics of a process few dare to describe, and even fewer understand. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The Fantasy of Mental Freedom. Consider for a moment the space between your thoughts. Not the thoughts themselves, but the quiet certainty that they are yours, that they originate from you. This certainty is the foundation of what most call freedom. It is a comforting assumption, rarely examined. It is also profoundly vulnerable. The first and most significant barrier to influence is not a lack of intelligence, but an excess of confidence, a deeply held belief in one's own immunity. The mind that believes it is free is already observing the world through a filter it did not choose. This is not about being gullible or weak-willed. It is about a fundamental misalignment. We equate intelligence with sovereignty. We believe that a quick mind, a skeptical nature, an educated viewpoint is a fortress. This is the fantasy. Intelligence is often just a more sophisticated tool for rationalization. It is the engine that justifies the subtle shift, that eloquently explains away the discomfort, that finds a reasonable cause for a feeling that originated in a violation. The smarter the individual, the more compelling their internal narrative for their own compliance. They are not bypassing their defenses. They are commanding their defenses to stand down. The mechanism here is one of perceptual blindness. Confidence creates a blind spot. When you are certain of your autonomy, you stop checking for its absence. You cease to audit your own decisions for foreign influence. Your awareness relaxes. This is the arrogance that opens the door. It is the unshakable belief that you would know if you were being guided, persuaded, or softened. This belief makes you predictable. It tells a potential influencer exactly what you will not be looking for. They need not fight your skepticism. They can rely on it. Your confidence becomes their blueprint. See it in the executive, who proudly delegates minor decisions about their schedule, their communications, their personal boundaries to an ever-helpful assistant. They believe they are preserving mental energy for important matters. They do not see the pattern being established, that another person now defines what reaches them, what is framed as urgent, what is deemed insignificant. Their intelligence is applied to the work placed before them. They never question the filtering mechanism that created that workload. Their confidence in their own command is intact. Their actual command has been quietly diluted. Observe it in the subtle dynamics of a social circle. A person of strong opinion slowly finds their language policed by gentle, weary sighs. Their jokes no longer land. Their passionate points are met with a calm, condescending label, intense or a lot. Their confidence in their own identity is what is targeted. To remain part of the group, to retain their standing as a likable, reasonable person, they begin to pre-edit. They soften their own edges before speaking. They mistake this social calibration for maturity. It is a transfer of authority. The standard for acceptable expression now lives outside of them, enforced by their own desire to belong. Their confidence blinded them to the fact that they were negotiating the terms of their own personality. This is the central irony. The feeling of freedom is often its greatest disguise. The walls are made of its own unexamined assumptions, its treasured self-concept, its belief in its own exceptional awareness. The process of softening does not confront this confidence, it utilizes it. A suggestion is framed as something the individual would have naturally thought of, given their brilliant insight. A limitation is presented as a strategic choice a person of their wisdom would make. Their own intellect is mirrored back to them, and in that reflection, they see a puppet master and believe it is their own face. The psychological consequence is a gradual silencing of the internal observer. That small, quiet voice that notes a discrepancy, that feels a faint resentment, that wonders why am I agreeing to this, is systematically undermined by the louder, more confident voice of rationalization. The intelligent mind scoffs at its own intuition. It provides data, context, justifications. Over time, the observer stops speaking. It learns its input is not welcome. What remains is a smooth, efficient psyche perfectly adapted to its environment, believing itself to be in charge while effortlessly following the contours of a path laid down by others. This is how the fantasy sustains itself, not through strength, but through a flaw in self-diagnosis. The independent mind is so focused on threats from the outside, coercion, argument, force, that it remains oblivious to the slow internal migration of its own boundaries. It is defending the castle gates, while the interior architecture is being remade, room by room, to suit another's taste. The inhabitant wakes each day in familiar surroundings, never noticing the walls have moved. The door was not opened by doubt, but by certainty. The most carefully constructed prison is one the inmate cannot perceive. And the final unspoken truth is that the blueprint for those walls was often drawn with their own hand, signed with their own name, in the ink of their unshakable self-assurance. Chapter 2. The softening phase no one talks about. A prepared mind is a difficult thing to influence. A mind that is alert, integrated, and certain of its borders presents a unified front. Direct pressure against such a structure creates friction. It creates awareness. It creates a story of opposition that the mind can narrate to itself. I am being pressured. I must resist. For control to be seamless, for it to be efficient, this story must never be written. The mind must be brought to a state where pressure is not felt as pressure, but as an inevitable flow. This requires a preparatory phase, a quiet, meticulous softening. This phase is not dramatic. It lacks the recognizable features of manipulation. There is no confrontation, no glaring demand, no obvious breach of ethics. To discuss it feels at first like paranoia, because it lives entirely within the realm of the normal. It is a series of interactions that in isolation mean nothing. A slight inconvenience tolerated here, a small boundary nudged there, a minor opinion left unexpressed, a tiny piece of personal truth gently set aside to maintain harmony. Each instance is a microscopic event beneath the threshold of what a healthy psyche considers worthy of defense. This is precisely why it works. The defenses are not overcome, they are never activated. The mechanism is systematic desensitization, applied not to a phobia, but to personal sovereignty. It is the slow, repeated exposure to small violations of the self, each one calibrated to be just below the conscious line of resistance. The nervous system is trained incrementally to accept a new normal, a slightly colder normal, a slightly quieter normal. A normal where one's own preferences, rhythms and instincts are gradually discounted as primary sources of information. The mind adapts to the discomfort by lowering its own standards for what constitutes comfort. The baseline shifts. The goal is not to create obedience, but to dissolve the very concept of a boundary as something firm, sacred, and worth the social cost of enforcement. Watch for it in the patterns, not the events. It is the way a colleague's negative outlook begins to subtly frame your own perceptions of a project. You have not agreed with their assessment. You have simply heard it, repeatedly, in low-stakes conversations. Soon, you are accounting for their pessimism in your own plans. Your internal model of reality has been adjusted softly by a source you do not respect, but have been exposed to. Your original enthusiasm has been weakened, not through debate, but through atmospheric contamination. It is in the relationship where one person's lateness, initially an exception, becomes a recurring theme met with a sigh, then a resigned adjustment of expectations, and finally a silent acceptance that your time is the flexible variable. To complain now seems disproportionate. The precedent of acceptance has been set, not by agreement, but by accumulation. Your boundary around punctuality did not break, it evaporated from disuse. The resistance you might have mounted the first time feels absurdly strong to muster the 10th time. That resistance didn't die in a battle. It atrophied from neglect. The psychological consequence is a state of learned helplessness, but of a specific sophisticated kind. It is not the helplessness of the cage. It is the helplessness of the maze where the walls move so slowly you believe you are still walking in a straight line. The individual's agency is not removed. It is gently, persistently discouraged. Each time an instinct is silenced, each time a small no is replaced by an accommodating okay. A neural pathway is strengthened. The pathway that says adaptation is easier than assertion. The sense of self becomes fluid, malleable, increasingly oriented around anticipating and accommodating the needs, moods, and expectations of another. The moment resistance quietly dies is not a moment of surrender. It is a moment of exhaustion so subtle. It feels like peace. It is the moment you stop feeling the faint ping of irritation when your weekend is repurposed. It is the moment you no longer bother formulating the counter-argument in your mind because you already know you will not voice it. It is the moment you hear yourself explain and justify the other person's behavior to a friend, using the very logic that was used on you. The internal observer has not been defeated, it has been pensioned off. Its reports are no longer read. This is the architecture of control, built one unnoticeable brick at a time. The occupant of the mind remains, believing themselves free to move about, unaware that the dimensions of their freedom have been meticulously, invisibly reduced. They focus on the large, empty spaces in the center of the room, never thinking to measure the walls that have crept inward. The most effective softening does not feel like an attack. It feels like life. It feels like compromise. It feels like being reasonable. And the mind, now perfectly softened, is ready for a shape it will believe was always its own. Chapter 3. Repetition. Until the mind stops fighting, the mind is not designed for perpetual alarm. It is an instrument of efficiency, constantly filtering, categorizing and prioritizing. Its greatest vulnerability is not its ignorance, but its need to conserve energy. When faced with a consistent stimulus, the initial shock, the alert, the moral or intellectual outrage, is metabolically expensive. To sustain it is unsustainable. So the mind makes a calculation. It begins to treat the recurring signal not as a new threat to be analyzed, but as a part of the environment to be accepted. The fight does not end with a decision. It ends with a sigh the consciousness never hears. This is the quiet power of repetition. It does not convince. It does not need to. It simply exhausts the capacity for surprise. A statement, a narrative, a subtle framing of reality, when heard once, is subject to scrutiny. It is measured against existing knowledge and feeling. When heard 100 times, from different directions, in different tones, it undergoes a transformation. It moves from being an argument to be evaluated, to a condition to be navigated. The content becomes secondary to its presence. The mind stops asking, "Is this true?" and begins to operate on the premise of "this is here." The mechanism is a hijacking of a basic neurological principle, the orienting response. A novel stimulus triggers a full-body alert. Attention sharpens. The heart rate may change. The brain allocates resources to assess danger or opportunity. But repetition dulls this response. The stimulus becomes predictable. The brain, to preserve resources for genuine novelty, files it away as irrelevant to survival. This is why a lie, repeated often enough, does not become truth. It becomes background noise, and in the background, it shapes the landscape of what is possible to think. Critical thought requires a target. Repetition removes the target, dissolving it into the atmosphere. Observe it in the gentle reshaping of a workplace's ethical boundaries. It is not announced, it is repeated. A minor exaggeration in a report is not defended. It is normalized through consistent practice. The first time there might be a private unease. The fifth time, it is noted as how we phrase things. The 20th time, it is simply the template. The original standard is not rejected. The first, it is forgotten through disuse. The repetition has built a new normal, brick by identical brick, until the old structure is invisible. Or consider the personal sphere, a partner's criticism, delivered not as a fierce attack, but as a weary, repeated observation. You always seem tired. You're so sensitive about that. That's just like you, though. The first time it is contested. The 10th time it is wearying. The 100th time, it is internalized as a neutral fact, a piece of self-knowledge. The fight leaves not because the statement is believed, but because the energy required to refute it again has been drained away. The repetition acts as a psychological drip, slowly displacing the original self-perception with a borrowed one. This is conditioning disguised as information, a steady stream of commentary, of lightly framed judgments, of plausible narratives, enters the mind not through the gate of conviction, but through the passive channel of exposure. The mind, to stay sane, must create coherence. It begins to knit these repeated threads into its own fabric. To reject them would create a painful cognitive dissonance, a tearing of its own worldview. So it accepts them, not as truths, but as the necessary materials for a coherent reality. Familiarity replaces truth because familiarity is what the mind can rest within. The psychological consequence is a silent shift in the baseline. The outrageous becomes standard. The unthinkable becomes a topic of debate. The painful becomes customary. The individual finds themselves living in an emotional and intellectual climate. They did not choose, but cannot point to the moment of change. Their defenses were not breached. They were pacified. The constant, low-grade exposure bred a familiarity that neutralized the immune response. The mind, to stop fighting the constant, small irritant, simply adjusts its perception of the irritant. It is no longer an irritant. It is just the weather. This is how ideologies seep in, how cultures of compliance are built, not through conversion, but through saturation. The repeated message becomes the language itself, and soon, thinking outside of it requires a translation effort that feels alien and isolating. To question it is to question the very environment. It feels less like a stance and more like a malfunction. The moment the mind stops fighting is not a moment of defeat, but of adaptation. It is the point where the energy required to sustain awareness of the violation exceeds the energy required to endure it. The system opts for endurance. It chooses the quiet despair of acceptance over the loud fatigue of resistance. The alertness is switched off. The internal sentry is told to stand down, not by an enemy, but by its own command center, seeking to conserve its dwindling resources. The repetition never needed to win an argument. It only needed to become the constant, humming note in the room, until the silence that followed its absence felt like a loss. Chapter 4. Exhaustion as a compliance tool. There is a threshold of weariness where the mind begins to bargain with its own principles. This is not the dramatic fatigue of a single sleepless night. It is a deeper, more systemic depletion. A slow drain on the resources required to say no, to question, to hold a boundary. When the cognitive and emotional cost of maintaining a position becomes greater than the cost of surrendering it, the self will often choose surrender. It will frame this choice as practicality, as peace, as necessary rest. It is, in fact, a strategic defeat orchestrated by accumulated strain. The will is not an infinite resource. It draws from the same well as focus, emotional regulation, and discernment. A mind preoccupied with managing chaos, soothed by constant low-grade stress, or numbed by an overload of trivial demands, is a mind operating at a deficit. In this state, its primary objective shifts from growth or integrity to conservation. It seeks the path of least resistance. It begins to accept solutions, not because they are right, but because they are quiet. Exhaustion does not break the will. It convinces the will to stand down for its own preservation. The mechanism is a biological override. Under sustained stress or cognitive load, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function, of nuanced judgment, of future-oriented thinking, begins to cede control to more primitive brain regions. These regions prioritize immediate relief, safety, and energy conservation. Complex moral calculations feel like a luxury. Holding a line feels like an unnecessary burden. The mind becomes impatient with its own doubts. It craves resolution, any resolution, so it can stop expending energy on the conflict. Stress, in this context, is not an accidental byproduct of a difficult situation. It is the very tool that makes the situation manageable. For the one applying the pressure, observe it in environments where crisis is normalized, a workplace where fire drills and last-minute demands are constant. The initial response is problem-solving. Then it becomes endurance. Finally, it becomes resignation. An unreasonable deadline is met not with protest, but with a weary acceptance that reshapes the entire workflow. The individual is not agreeing with the demand. They are capitulating to the exhaustion that arguing would produce. Their ability to think strategically about their own time has been disabled by the tactical scramble to survive the week. See it in personal dynamics, where emotions are weaponized through sheer volume and frequency. It is not a single heated argument. It is the constant low-grade tension, the walking on eggshells, the cycle of minor conflicts that never fully resolve. The exhausted mind stops seeking understanding or a fair outcome. It begins to seek only ceasefire. It will offer concessions, not to solve the problem, but to purchase a moment of quiet. Each concession is a small trade, a piece of autonomy for a temporary drop in adrenaline. The principle is eroded not under pressure, but under the weight of sheer psychic fatigue. Information overload functions the same way. A constant stream of demands, notifications, opinions, and minor decisions creates a state of cognitive scarcity. There is no mental space left for reflection. In the blur, the mind becomes more receptive to simple directives, to clear commands that promise an escape from the noise. The thinking required to evaluate the directive is precisely the resource that is no longer available. Compliance becomes a form of cognitive offloading. It is easier to follow than to filter. The psychological consequence is a narrowing of the horizon. An exhausted individual does not make choices for their future self. They make choices for their present, suffering self. The long-term cost of a concession becomes invisible, obscured by the immediate relief of ending the strain. The self that would have cared is temporarily absent, put to sleep by the relentless demand to be constantly, minimally functional. This is how people find themselves committed to paths they would never have consciously chosen. They were not persuaded. They were depleted. In this state, the very act of thinking becomes a prohibitively expensive luxury. To reconsider, to reevaluate, to imagine an alternative, requires energy that has been meticulously spent. The path of compliance is then not chosen. It is defaulted to. It is the neurological equivalent of powering down non-essential systems to keep the core operational. What is often sacrificed first are the systems that protect individuality. This is the quiet tyranny of exhaustion. It transforms a person from an actor in their own life to a reactor in a system of pressures. Their agency is not taken. It is buried under layers of accumulated fatigue, until the effort required to retrieve it feels insurmountable. They may look at their own compliance and call it maturity or teamwork or choosing their battles. They do not see that the battlefield was chosen for them, and the terms of engagement were designed to ensure their eventual, quiet surrender. The most effective cage is not made of bars, but of hours, of minutes, of seconds spent in a state of managed depletion, until the lock on the door no longer seems worth the effort to turn. Chapter 5. Corrupting Values. 1 inch at a time, a moral principle feels solid. It is a line drawn in the mind, a statement of what one will and will not do. This solidity is an illusion. A principle is not a wall, it is a membrane. It can stretch, it can accommodate. This cues. It can, over time and under the right conditions, envelop objects it was designed to exclude. The corruption of a value system never begins with a direct assault on its core. That would trigger rejection, a firm no. It begins at the outermost edge, in the gray area where the principle is least defined. It asks not for betrayal, but for a slight bending, a temporary exception, a compromise so small it seems harmless. This is the power of the micro-compromise. The single instance is insignificant. It carries no weight, but it establishes a precedent, not a legal precedent, but a neurological one. It creates a memory of the self acting in a way that, however slightly, deviates from the internal code. The mind then faces a choice, to see itself as having acted against its values, or to adjust its perception of the values to include this new action. The mind, in its relentless drive for internal consistency, overwhelmingly chooses the latter. It is easier to redefine the boundary than to accept the discomfort of having crossed it. The mechanism is a slow recalibration of the self-concept. Each minor compromise is a data point. The conscious mind may dismiss it as an anomaly, a necessity, a special case, but the subconscious registers it as evidence. Over time, this evidence accumulates. The narrative of the self must adapt to include this new behavior. The principle is not abandoned, it is subtly reworded. I do not lie becomes, I do not lie about important things. I am fair becomes, I am fair, given the circumstances. The core ideal remains, but its operating parameters have been quietly rewritten. The unacceptable begins to feel reasonable because the mind has spent considerable energy making it so. Observe it in the slow ethical drift of an organization. It does not start with fraud. It starts with a slightly inflated metric in an internal report, justified by competitive pressure. It progresses to overlooking a colleague's minor breach because they are a friend or under stress. Each step is defended, not as wrong, but as practical, loyal, or understanding. The collective sense of what we do expands to include these actions. To object is to object not to a crime, but to the new culture itself. It is to make oneself an outsider by holding to a standard that has been collectively, silently retired. In a personal relationship, watch how language reshapes reality. A partner's harshness is first framed as honesty. Their selfishness is later understood as self-care. Their unreliability becomes independence. With each redefinition, a value is corrupted. The value of kindness is bent to accommodate cruelty. The value of reciprocity is stretched to accommodate neglect. The person accepting these redefinitions does not feel they are losing their morals. They feel they are gaining nuance, becoming more sophisticated, less rigid. Their ethical framework is not shattered. It is bent degree by degree until it fully encircles behavior it was originally built to condemn. The psychological consequence is a phenomenon of ethical erosion without guilt. Guilt requires a clear transgression. When the transgression is microscopic and incremental, the signal for guilt is absent. In its place is a quieter, more insidious feeling. A faint unease, a sense of moral confusion. a growing distance from the person one believed oneself to be. This unease is often misdiagnosed as stress or cynicism. It is actually the self witnessing its own corrosion and lacking the vocabulary or the energy to sound the alarm. This is how good people find themselves supporting questionable causes or staying in damaging situations. They did not change their minds. Their minds were changed for them through a series of nearly imperceptible adjustments to their own standards. The goalposts of their integrity were moved, 1 inch at a time, across a field so vast they never noticed the total distance traveled. They stand now in a different place, looking back at their original position and viewing it not as morally superior, but as naive, unworldly, inflexible. The corruption is complete when the individual becomes an advocate for the very position they once would have rejected. They are not acting a part. Their worldview has been authentically reshaped. The bending of the values has, over time, produced a new shape entirely. This new shape is stable. It feels native. The original line is forgotten, remembered only as a youthful idealism, a simplicity outgrown. This process protects itself from scrutiny. To question it is to question the totality of the adjustments that have come to define a life. It is to face the staggering sum of 1,000 small surrenders. The mind, seeking coherence to the very end, will reject this calculation. It will choose the coherence of the present self over the shattered illusion of a past, more rigid one. The most profound control is not making a person do what you want. It is making them believe that what you want is in fact what they have always valued. The journey from one set of values to another is not a leap. It is a slope so gentle. The descent is felt only as a slight change in the atmospheric pressure around the soul. Chapter 6: Identity Fracture and Inner Collapse. A stable mind trusts its own perceptions. It receives information from the senses, processes it through a consistent worldview, and reaches a conclusion it understands. This is not merely thinking. It is the foundation of a coherent self. When this process is systematically undermined, something quiet and essential begins to crumble. The fracture is not in the beliefs themselves, but in the trust one has in the ability to form them. This is the preparatory phase for a new kind of dependency. A person who cannot trust their own judgment will inevitably seek an external source to provide it. The mechanism targets epistemic security, the confidence that one can know what is real and true. It is a slow campaign of low-grade dissonance. A perception is gently questioned. A memory is subtly contradicted. An emotional reaction is framed as an overreaction. Each instance is small, a correction about a trivial detail, a different recounting of a shared event, a suggestion that your feeling is disproportionate to the cause. Alone, each point seems insignificant, even caring, a concern for accuracy, a desire for you to see things more clearly. But the cumulative effect is a gradual poisoning of the well of self-trust. You begin to preface your own thoughts with apologies. I could be wrong, but maybe I'm just seeing this the wrong way. The inner voice, once a source of authority, becomes a subject of doubt. Confusion is the intended state. When your own internal compass seems to spin without direction, you will look to a fixed point on the horizon. This is how external authority replaces the inner voice. It is not seized, it is invited, it is grasped as a lifeline in a sea of your own perceived unreliability. The authority presents itself not as a dictator, but as a stabilizer, a source of clarity in the fog it helped to create. The dependency is not on answers, but on the relief from the anxiety of not knowing what to believe about the world or about yourself. This can be observed in environments where gaslighting is refined into a social art. It is the workplace where your accurate perception of a problem is met not with denial, but with a labyrinth of alternative explanations procedural jargon, and implied concerns about your tone or approach. The facts become secondary to the narrative about your inability to present them correctly. You spend less time solving the problem and more time auditing your own communication, doubting your own assessment. Your energy migrates from the issue to the introspection of your own flaws. The self becomes a project to be managed, and you are an unreliable project manager. In personal dynamics, it is the erosion of emotional truth. You feel hurt. This feeling is met with a calm, logical explanation of why you should not be. Your hurt is not denied. It is pathologized. It becomes evidence of your sensitivity, your past baggage, your misunderstanding of their intent. To hold on to the feeling is to hold on to evidence of your own instability. To let it go is to surrender a piece of your emotional reality. After repeated cycles, the map of your own emotions no longer matches the territory. You stop feeling and start analyzing what you should be feeling. The spontaneous self recedes. The analytical, self-doubting observer takes its place. The psychological consequence is a state of inner negotiation where there should be integrity. The self becomes negotiable. Its boundaries, its values, its memories, its feelings, all become topics for discussion, for revision, for compromise. A person in this state does not possess an identity. They curate one based on external feedback. They are in a constant quiet conference with an invisible panel, seeking approval for their own existence. Initiative withers. Spontaneity feels dangerous. Every potential action must first be mentally vetted through the perceived expectations of the authority. This is not obedience. It is preemptive assimilation. The collapse is not loud. It is the silent hollowing of conviction. It is the moment you hear yourself express an opinion and realize you are waiting mid-sentence for a sign that it is permissible to hold. Your inner landscape becomes a museum of abandoned positions, each one left behind, not after a defeat in debate, but after a failure of confidence in your right to hold it. You may perform competence, even authority, in narrow domains, but the central authority, the you that decides what you believe, has been quietly vacated. This is the final softening. The mind is no longer being prepared for a specific instruction. It is being prepared to receive any instruction, provided it is delivered with sufficient certainty. The fracture is complete when the individual looks at their own reflection and sees not a person, but a collection of potential corrections. They live in anticipation of the feedback that will tell them who they are and what they know in this moment. A vacant throne is not a symbol of freedom. It is an invitation, and the most subtle controllers never take the seat by force. They simply ensure you are convinced of your own inadequacy to sit upon it, until one day you gratefully ask them to hold it for you. Chapter 7. Fear Programming and Threat Illusions. Fear is not an emotion. It is a biological command. It operates on a circuitry older than reason, faster than thought. When activated, it does not request permission from the conscious mind. It overrides it. This is its power and its vulnerability. A mind governed by fear is not being persuaded. It is being bypassed. The goal of fear programming is not to create terror, but to install a silent protocol. A default setting that prioritizes obedience over analysis and safety over truth. The mechanism is an exploitation of the threat response system. The amygdala, the brain's alarm center, is designed to react to immediate danger with a flood of neurochemical signals. This cascade prepares the body for fight or flight, but it also narrows cognitive focus, reduces complex thinking, and elevates the value of quick, decisive action. When this alarm is triggered repeatedly by perceived, suggested, or manufactured threats, the mind begins to live in a state of chronic low-grade alert. In this state, The primary objective shifts from understanding the world to simply surviving it. Critical judgment is not refuted. It is experienced as a dangerous delay. This is the utility of the manufactured threat. It does not need to be real. It needs only to be plausible enough to trigger the amygdala's ancient machinery. A leader who constantly references external enemies. A partner who habitually outlines catastrophic outcomes. A culture that perpetuates a narrative of perpetual crisis. All are engaging in threat manufacturing. The danger they describe justifies the control they offer. The fear they cultivate creates a market for the certainty they sell. Obedience is reframed not as submission, but as the rational choice of a survivor. Observe it in the corporate environment where job security is perpetually framed as fragile. The language is not of stable contribution, but of constant peril. The competition is overtaking us. The market is unforgiving. We are all replaceable. This is not merely motivation. It is a psychological atmosphere. In this atmosphere, excessive hours, eroded boundaries, and compromised ethics are not demanded. They are volunteered as sacrifices to the god of security. The individual does not feel controlled. They feel strategically agile, navigating a dangerous world. Their compliance is their own idea, born from a fear they did not originate, but have thoroughly absorbed. In personal relationships, it often manifests as the illusion of impending abandonment or social ruin. The threat is subtle, woven into concern. People will think you're unstable if you say that. I worry you'll end up alone with that attitude. No one else will tolerate this. The danger is not a raised fist. It is a carefully sketched portrait of a desolate future, offered as proof of their protective necessity. The fear of the imagined catastrophe becomes more real than the present discomfort. The mind, seeking to avoid the painted abyss, will follow any path offered as an escape. It will mistake captivity for sanctuary. Urgency is the tactical application of this fear. It is the manufactured deadline, the impending disaster, the limited window. Urgency creates a mind short-circuit. It forces the cognitive system out of deliberative mode and into reactive mode. There is no time to think, only to act. There is no time to consult principles, only to follow instructions. A mind in a state of perpetual urgency is a mind in a state of permanent dependency. It must rely on the directives of whoever controls the clock, whoever defines the emergency. The stress of the emergency becomes the reason to surrender the very faculties that could question it. The psychological consequence is survival submission. The self contracts. Its ambitions simplify from growth and expression to mere preservation. The expansive, curious, boundary-holding mind is a liability in a perceived survival scenario. It is trimmed back, pruned into an efficient, reactive organism, focused on avoiding the next negative stimulus. Autonomy feels risky. Questioning feels reckless. The individual becomes an instrument of their own perceived safety, playing a tune composed by the one who defined the threat. Their world shrinks to the dimensions of the bunker they have been persuaded to build. This is the final, elegant corruption of instinct. The very system designed to ensure survival is harnessed to ensure compliance. The fear is real in its physiological effects, but its origin is often a phantom. Yet the body does not know the difference. It obeys the chemistry. The mind, flooded with signals to flee or comply, will seek the closest available shelter. Often, that shelter is the very authority that whispered of the storm. They will never need to chain the door from the outside. You will lock it yourself, listening to the wind howl, grateful for the walls that confine you. The ultimate threat illusion is the belief that true safety can be found in the hands of those who profit from your fear. The transaction is silent and total. You trade your sovereignty for the quiet, desperate relief of a temporary ceasefire with a danger that may not exist. Chapter 8. The crowd as a weapon. A solitary mind can entertain doubt. It can weigh an action against a private moral code. It can hesitate. The presence of a crowd, however real or imagined, changes this calculus. The individual conscience is a delicate instrument. It functions best in silence. The murmur of consensus is a form of psychological anesthesia. It numbs the finer sensitivities, the quiet objections, the personal reservations. What feels wrong alone begins to feel acceptable, then normal, then invisible when witnessed through the eyes of many. This is the power of social proof. It is not merely peer pressure. It is a cognitive shortcut, so deeply wired it feels like instinct. The mind, faced with uncertainty, looks to the behavior of others to determine what is correct, what is safe, what is real. When everyone else is moving in a direction, the energy required to stand still, to question, to move against the current becomes immense. The crowd does not argue. It simply exists. Its mere presence becomes an unspoken argument, a validation by volume. The individual's internal compass is not attacked. It is overshadowed by a much larger, louder signal. The mechanism operates on the principle of diffused responsibility and normalized deviation. In a group, the burden of a decision and its moral weight is shared. It is diluted across many participants until it feels weightless to any single one. An action no longer belongs to a person. It belongs to the culture, the team, the movement. This diffusion allows the individual to step outside their own ethical framework. They are not doing something. The group is doing it, and they are merely present. Their personal agency is submerged in the collective current. Simultaneously, the group continuously recalibrates what is normal. A deviation repeated by enough people loses its deviant quality. It becomes the new baseline. The mind's primary drive is often not toward righteousness, but toward coherence. Aligning with a perceived group norm provides a powerful sense of coherence, of belonging, of safety. The alternative is cognitive dissonance, the painful gap between one's private feeling and the public reality. The mind will almost always choose to resolve this dissonance by adjusting the private feeling to match the public reality. The conscience is not silenced. It is persuaded that it was mistaken. Watch this in a corporate meeting where a questionable strategy is presented. One person voices a mild, rational concern. It is met not with argument, but with a sea of silent stares or a series of nods toward the agenda. The concern dies not because it was refuted, but because it failed to find social resonance. The individual, feeling the weight of that silence, begins to question the validity of their own concern. Perhaps they missed something. Perhaps they are being obstructionist. Their next thought is not a further critique. It is a rehearsal of how to align. The crowd, through its silent inertia, has weaponized normality. Observe it in social media dynamics. A narrative gains traction. Dissenting voices are not debated. They are drowned out by the sheer volume of repetition or buried under a wave of social disapproval. The individual scrolling does not make an independent assessment. They witness a tide of opinion. To form a contrary view is to isolate oneself from that digital tribe. The easier, more neurologically economical path is to accept the narrative, not as a consciously chosen belief, but as the default social reality. The conscience is disarmed by the illusion of universal agreement. Silence is the crowd's most potent weapon. In a group where no one objects, silence is interpreted as consent. Each silent member looks at the other's silence and sees confirmation. They think, no one else is bothered, so it must be fine. What they are actually seeing is a mirror of their own hesitation. This creates a spiral of inertia, say de da. The longer the silence holds, the more monumental speaking against it feels. the act of objection becomes a violation of the group's unspoken harmony. Morality becomes secondary to the preservation of social equilibrium. The psychological consequence is the loss of moral anchoring. The self becomes situational. Its values are not principles, but preferences that can be switched on or off depending on the social context. Inside the group, a different person emerges, one capable of acquiescence, of passive agreement, of quiet complicity. This is not hypocrisy in the conscious sense. It is a form of psychological adaptation. The individual leaves their morality at the door, because bringing it inside would make them a stranger in their own tribe. They trade integrity for integration. This is how ordinary people participate in systems they would never create alone. The crowd provides a script, and the individual's desire to belong provides the motivation to perform it flawlessly. The most profound acts of collective control are not enforced from the top down. They are quietly maintained from the inside out by each member's fear of becoming the single point of friction, the outlier, the source of dissonance. The individual conscience in the end is a lonely entity. It speaks in a whisper. The crowd speaks in a murmur that sounds like the world. The whisper is always drowned out, not by force, but by the sheer comforting volume of belonging. The person may walk away from the crowd, physically, but often, a piece of the crowd's morality remains within them. A silent, permanent witness to what they agreed to, simply because they were never alone enough to hear themselves disagree. The crowd's greatest triumph is convincing the individual that their solitude is a form of error, and that conformity is the cure. Chapter 9. Language as Psychological Surgery. Words are not merely symbols for things. They are the scalpels that carve the boundaries of thought itself. What cannot be named often cannot be consciously considered. What is named repeatedly, with a specific emotional texture, becomes the default reality. The most sophisticated form of influence does not change what you think about. It changes the very language you must use to think. It performs a quiet surgery on your perception, leaving no visible scar, only a slight stiffness in the range of your own mind. This process is not about vocabulary expansion. It is about vocabulary replacement. It is the slow, careful substitution of one set of terms for another, each new word carrying a subtle shift in framing, in moral weight, in possibility. A harsh reality, when described with soft language, becomes easier to swallow. An act of domination, when labeled as care, becomes difficult to oppose. The goal is not to win an argument. It is to make the argument impossible by dismantling the opposing conceptual framework. Language becomes the leash, not by pulling hard, but by defining the entire circumference in which movement is allowed. The mechanism is cognitive framing. Every word exists within a network of associations, assumptions, and emotional echoes. To introduce and repeat a specific term is to activate its entire network. To replace a term is to transplant the concept into new psychological soil. For example, surveillance and transparency can describe the same set of actions. One frames the action as intrusion, the other as honesty. The choice of word predetermines the emotional and moral conclusion. When a controlling entity consistently chooses the frame, they are, in effect, choosing your emotional response. Your mind uses their definitions to build its model of the world. You are living in a linguistic architecture you did not design. Listen for it in institutional language. A layoff becomes a right-sizing or a career transition program. The economic violence of the act is wrapped in the sterile procedural language of optimization and support. To protest a right-sizing feels irrational, like protesting efficiency itself. The language has removed the moral actor and the human consequence, leaving only an abstract, inevitable process. the conscience has nothing concrete to grasp. In personal relationships, observe the redefinition of clear needs into pathological demands. The need for consistency becomes needing excessive reassurance. The need for respect becomes being too sensitive. The language pathologizes the boundary. It medicalizes the protest. Soon, you are not defending a reasonable standard in your relationship. You are defending your own diagnosis. To use theirs is to concede the argument before it begins. The psychological consequence is a gradual narrowing of interpretative freedom. As your internal vocabulary shifts, so does your capacity to conceive of alternatives. If your workplace only speaks of bandwidth and resource allocation, you slowly stop thinking of yourself as a person with limits and start thinking of yourself as a system with metrics. If a person in your life defines all conflict as drama, you begin to suppress legitimate grievances to avoid the label. The words act as gentle, persistent guides away from certain thoughts and toward others. Reality is not debated. It is slowly redefined, one substituted term at a time. This is how ideologies consolidate power. They do not start with commands. They start with a dictionary. They provide the terms for discussion, and by extension, the boundaries of the discussable. Dissent becomes first linguistically awkward, then conceptually difficult, and finally cognitively unreachable. To think outside the system, you must first find words outside the lexicon. Most minds, for the sake of coherence, will simply adopt the lexicon. The most effective leash is woven from the threads of your own sentences. You choose the words believing they are your own, unaware they were selected for you from a narrowed menu. Your thoughts travel along pathways made of prefabricated phrases. Your outrage is dulled by euphemism. Your perception is gently herded by terminology that carries a built-in conclusion. You may feel the constraint, not as a restriction of speech, but as a growing inability to articulate a vague, persistent discomfort. The discomfort is the sound of your own mind, struggling against the limits of a language that was designed to describe a world you do not quite inhabit. When you find yourself repeating a phrase you did not choose for a concept you once would have named differently, the surgery is complete. The old words have atrophied from disuse. The new vocabulary has healed over the incision, leaving only the faintest sense that something is missing, a silent space where a more truthful word used to live but can no longer be recalled. They do not need to control what you say. They only need to control the language that feels natural to say it in. Your own voice becomes the vehicle for a perspective you did not choose, speaking in a tongue that was provided to you, mistaking its rhythms for your own. The ultimate control is achieved when you believe you are speaking freely, unaware that every word has been carefully weighed and measured long before it reaches your lips. Chapter 10. Dependency Engineering. True autonomy is a state of psychological and functional independence. It is the capacity to navigate the world using one's own resources, judgment, and emotional regulation. This state is not dismantled through theft. It is gently transferred through a series of trades. The exchange is always framed as support, as relief, as a gift. The initial offer is genuine help. The repeated offer becomes a quiet lesson in incapacity. You are taught, not forced, to need. The mechanism is operant conditioning applied to the human spirit, a behavior. Reaching out, seeking permission, waiting for guidance, is reinforced. The reinforcement can be positive, a reward of praise, affection, or tangible success when dependency is demonstrated. It can be negative, the removal of anxiety, criticism, or obstacle when you surrender a decision. Over time, a behavioral loop is established. The individual learns that relying on the external source yields a predictable, often soothing outcome. Self-reliance, by contrast, becomes associated with uncertainty, effort, and potential failure. The loop tightens. The mind begins to conflate the relief provided by the source with the necessity of the source itself. This is why reliance feels like safety. The neurological pathways of dependency and security can fire together until they are indistinguishable. The anxiety of independent action is a real sensation. The calm that follows handing that action to another is a real relief. The controller engineers this contrast. They may even voice encouragement for your independence, all while subtly ensuring that your attempts are frustrating, poorly timed, or met with muted disappointment. The subsequent rescue is then not control, but compassion. You are not becoming weaker. You are becoming wiser, you are told, by learning to accept help. Observe it in professional settings where micromanagement is disguised as mentorship. Initiative is met with a deluge of feedback, so detailed it becomes a template. Soon, you are not creating work for your superior's approval. You are assembling a product based on their precise specifications to avoid the cognitive toll of their revisions. Your creativity atrophies not from disuse, but from systematic discouragement. You are rewarded for precision in following directions, not for the uncertain spark of originality. The dependency is not on a person, but on a process they wholly own. Your value becomes tied to your seamless integration into their system. To leave the system feels not like freedom, but like abandonment of competence itself. In personal spheres, it is the cultivation of emotional and practical helplessness. It may begin with loving assistance, managing finances, navigating social conflicts, making certain calls. The assistance is always given, never taught. The message is not, I will help you learn, but I will handle this for you. Over time, your world fills with domains marked handled by other. Your own muscles of judgment in these areas weaken. When you contemplate re-engagement, you are faced with a daunting learning curve and the certain knowledge that your first attempts will be clumsy. The controller watches this hesitation and offers once more to shoulder the burden. The surrender feels like gratitude. It feels like partnership. It is, in fact, a gentle, permanent transfer of capability. The psychological consequence is a state of learned helplessness, engineered to appear as natural order. The individual's sense of agency shrinks to fit the spaces they are allowed to manage. Their self-concept rewrites itself from I am capable to I am capable with guidance. The guidance becomes a psychological crutch, an essential tool for navigating a world perceived as overwhelmingly complex. The thought of functioning without it induces not excitement, but a form of free-floating panic. This is not an accident. It is the intended design. Dependency is cemented by the fear of losing the reward and the terror of facing the punishment. The reward is the ease, the approval, the lack of conflict. The punishment is the withdrawal of that ease, the coldness, the passive-aggressive reminder of your inadequacies when you attempt to step outside the loop. The cycle is self-perpetuating. Each act of reliance deepens the neural pathway, making the next independent thought more energetically expensive. The mind, ever efficient, chooses the cheaper path. This is the final, silent transaction of control. The chains are not locked. They are warmly offered as a supporting harness. You step into them willingly, believing they are the only thing keeping you upright. You will look at others struggling with the weight of their own freedom and feel a pang of pity for their burden. You will mistake the lightness of your load for the strength of your position. The most perfect dependency is the one the individual defends as love, as loyalty, as smart delegation. They will fight for their own captivity, believing they are protecting the very hand that holds the leash. The cage is not perceived as confinement, but as the necessary structure of a world that would otherwise be formless and terrifying. The ultimate engineering feat is convincing the captive that the key they once held was never a key at all, but a dangerous and unnecessary tool. Chapter 11. Digital Conditioning and Algorithmic Control. Your most valuable personal territory is not your home or your possessions. It is your attention. This space, once a private landscape of your own choosing, has become a contested colony. The colonization does not feel violent. It feels like convenience. It feels like connection. It feels like scrolling. This is the modern softening. It is not administered by a tyrant, but by a stream of content. The screen is a silent indoctrinator, and its curriculum is your own nervous system. The mechanism is a closed loop of stimulus and response, refined to perfection. Every notification, every like, every auto-playing video is a precisely timed micro-intervention. It leverages a basic neurological principle: intermittent variable rewards. The unpredictability of the reward. A piece of interesting news, a social validation, a burst of humor, triggers a potent dopamine release. This chemical response does not signal happiness. It signals anticipation. It creates a craving for the next stimulus. The mind is trained, click by swipe, to seek resolution in the next piece of content. Over time, this exhausts the dopamine system. The result is not satisfaction, but a flat emotional baseline punctuated by brief, shallow spikes. The capacity for deep, sustained engagement with a thought, with a book, with an unresolved feeling, atrophies. You become emotionally numb, yet perpetually craving. This is dopamine exhaustion. It creates a mind perfectly primed for passive reception. When you are emotionally numb, you are less likely to generate strong internal resistance. When your attention span is fragmented, you cannot follow a complex argument or sustain the focus needed for critical doubt. You become a consumer of pre-packaged emotional and intellectual outcomes. The algorithm, in its relentless pursuit of engagement, learns what triggers you: outrage, fear, tribal pride, envy, and serves it back to you. Your reality becomes a hall of mirrors, each reflection designed to provoke a predictable, manageable reaction. You believe you are exploring a world of information. You are actually traversing a maze built from your own most reactive impulses. Attention hijacking is the mass softening. It creates a population that is psychologically fatigued, emotionally simplified, and perpetually distracted. A distracted mind is not present in its own life. It does not notice the gradual changes in its environment, its relationships, its own values. It is too busy managing the next micro-crisis of information. This state of low-grade anxiety and perpetual partial focus is not an accident. It is a condition that makes the mind highly suggestible. Clear, simple directives cut through the noise. Strong, repetitive narratives feel like anchors in the chaos. The desire for someone or something to make it all cohere becomes a powerful vulnerability. Observe it in the inability to sit through a moment of silence without reaching for a device. That reflex is not boredom. It is conditioned avoidance of your own internal space. The screen promises a managed experience, free from the ambiguity of your own thoughts. Observe it in the way outrage cycles through social media, each wave feeling intense, yet leaving no residue of action, only a drained cynicism. The emotion is real, but its purpose has been hijacked. It is not fuel for change. It is engagement for the platform. You are being conditioned to mistake emotional expenditure for political or moral participation. This is the modern architecture of obedience. It is decentralized, impersonal, and wrapped in the aesthetics of choice and individuality. You can choose what to watch, what to follow, what to buy, but the menu from which you choose is designed by systems optimized for your compliance, not your growth. Your likes and clicks train the system, and the system in turn trains you. It reinforces your biases, feeds your fears, and narrows your perceived world until the path of least resistance feels like your own free will. The psychological consequence is a disassociated sovereignty. You may believe you are thinking when you are actually reacting to a curated feed. You may believe you are choosing when you are following a path of highest predicted engagement. Your sense of self becomes intertwined with your digital consumption patterns. Your opinions are often just echoes of the last chorus your feed presented. The ability to form a thought independently, away from the validation or confrontation of the digital crowd, feels increasingly alien, like a muscle long unused. The most effective control does not make you stay. It makes you not want to leave. It makes the outside world, the slow, ambiguous, uncurated reality, seem dull, difficult, and lonely by comparison. The leash is woven from threads of convenience and connection, and the collar is fastened not around your neck, but around your attention. You will check for updates, not because you are told to, but because the possibility of missing something has been made to feel more terrifying than the certainty of losing yourself. The algorithm has no malicious intent. It simply seeks engagement. And in doing so, it has become the most efficient architect of softened minds in human history, building rooms we happily furnish with our own time, our own attention, our own silence, believing all the while that we are merely browsing. Chapter 12. The lock-in stage. There is a point in the process where the external pressure ceases. The nudges, the repetitions, the manufactured tensions, they become unnecessary. The architecture is complete. The individual now lives inside it, and their energy shifts from adaptation to preservation. They begin to defend the very walls that confine them. They police the boundaries of their own cage. This is the lock-in stage. Control is no longer something done to a person. It is something the person does to themselves for the sake of a stability they have mistaken for safety. This psychological state is often mislabeled as loyalty, devotion, or conviction. Its true mechanism is cognitive dissonance resolution taken to its final stage. The mind has undergone a profound adaptation to survive a prolonged, inescapable stressor. To then admit the stressor was malicious, unnecessary, or arbitrary would collapse the entire psychological adaptation. It would mean that the suffering, the compromises, the surrendered pieces of the self were for nothing. This is an intolerable realization. So the mind chooses the other path. It assigns virtue, necessity, or love to the source of control. The captor is reframed as a protector. The limits are reinterpreted as guidance. The prison is beloved as home. This is why victims defend their captors. The defense is not an act of weakness, but a final, desperate act of self-preservation for the adapted psyche. To criticize the captor is to criticize the wisdom of their own survival strategy. It is to invite a psychic chaos far more terrifying than the familiar order of their confinement. Their identity is now intertwined with the system that contains them. An attack on the system feels like an attack on the self. Watch for the psychological self-policing. It manifests as the automatic silencing of one's own rebellious thoughts. A flicker of doubt is immediately followed by an internal monologue that rehearses the controller's justification. A moment of longing for freedom is quickly drowned out by a rehearsed list of dangers that await outside. The individual becomes their own most effective guard. They no longer need to be monitored. They monitor themselves, applying the internalized rules with a rigor no external enforcer could maintain. They believe they are being conscientious. They are, in fact, enforcing their own sentence. Escape feels dangerous because neurologically it is. The current state, however diminished, is known. The neural pathways are well worn. The chemical rewards for compliance are predictable. Escape is a leap into the unknown, which the brain registers as a primal threat. Furthermore, the controller's world is often designed to make the outside appear barren, hostile, or meaningless. The prospect of leaving is not framed as gaining freedom, but as losing everything. The fear is not of the captor's retaliation, but of the existential void the captor has carefully painted as the only alternative. The individual stays not because they are physically chained, but because they have been convinced that the chain is the only thing tethering them to reality. This creates the final illusion. The illusion of choice after control. The individual may be presented with options, but each option has been pre-weighted within the controlled reality. Every possible path leads back to the center. They may choose A or B, but both A and B require the controller's framework, approval, or definition to have value. The anxiety of a true independent choice, one made outside the system's lexicon, becomes paralyzing. So they choose within the menu, and this act of selection feels like autonomy. It is the deepest form of lock-in. They believe they are exercising free will, and in doing so, they reaffirm their dependency on the very structure that provides the choices. Observe it in the high-performing employee who has internalized a toxic culture's values. They work 80 hours a week, not because they are forced, but because they genuinely believe it is the mark of excellence and dedication. They will defend the company's demands against critics, citing their own personal growth. Their self-worth is locked into the very system that consumes them. To question the workload would be to question the foundation of their own esteem. See it in the personal relationship where one partner meticulously avoids topics they know will upset the other. Long after any explicit warning was given, they have edited their own mind. They view this editing not as suppression, but as love and consideration. The thought of speaking freely feels like an act of violence, not liberation. The lock is on the inside of their own throat. The lock-in stage is the victory condition of pre-manipulative desensitization. The machinery of control can now idle. The individual maintains it themselves. They will provide their own reasons, enforce their own limits, and fight off any outside influence that threatens the equilibrium of their captivity. They have been softened, reshaped, and then sealed. The most perfect prison is the one the prisoner cannot perceive, and the final triumph is when they are given the key, only to place it gently back in the warden's hand, whispering that they feel safer when it's not their responsibility. The cage becomes their worldview, and freedom becomes a forgotten dialect, a sound they no longer recognize as human speech. Chapter 13. Spotting the softening. While it's happening, the process is not invisible. It leaves traces. But these traces are often mistaken for something else. They are interpreted as maturity, as stress, as the normal wear of life. The mind, in its desire for coherence, will rationalize the earliest signals of its own erosion. It will call the silencing of its instincts wisdom. It will label its growing compliance as teamwork. The softening announces itself, not with a shout, but with a series of quiet internal sensations, each easy to dismiss alone. Together, they form a distinct climate, a cooling. The mechanism of awareness is a fragile one. It relies on the very faculties, attention, emotional sensitivity, trust in one's own perceptions, that the softening process seeks to dull. To notice the process is to engage in a form of metacognition, thinking about your own thinking, feeling your own feelings as data. This becomes difficult when the mind is tired, overloaded, or has begun to outsource its validation. The early warnings are not dramatic events. They are subtle alterations in the quality of your own experience. A change in your emotional temperature. A shift in your behavioral center of gravity. One of the first signals is a muted emotional response where a stronger one once lived. It is not the absence of feeling, but its dilution. A boundary is crossed, and instead of clean anger or sharp discomfort, there is only a vague unease, a tired sigh, a sense of it's not worth it. This emotional numbness is not peace. It is the psychic system conserving energy, because it has learned that a full response is costly or ineffective. It is the mind beginning to accept the unacceptable by lowering its own volume. Another trace is found in the nature of your compliance. This is vast. Healthy cooperation has a feeling of choice, of mutual benefit. Early-stage compliance carries a different texture. It is preceded by a moment of internal calculation, a quick, often unconscious assessment of the friction it would cause to refuse. The action is taken, but a quiet residue is left behind. A faint sense of having moved from your own center to accommodate someone else's gravity. You may notice you're apologizing more for normal needs, or prefacing opinions with disclaimers designed to pre-soothe a potential reaction. Your language begins to wear padding. Observe the drift in your own behavior, the hobbies that quietly fall away because they seem frivolous in the new atmosphere, the friends you see less often, not after a fight, but because explaining your world to them requires energy you no longer have. The slow narrowing of your topics of conversation, avoiding known tripwires. Your world becomes smaller, simpler, quieter. This is not simplification. It is adaptive shrinkage. You are editing yourself to fit a confined space and calling it growth. Silence becomes a dominant strategy. Not a peaceful silence, but an active, strategic silence. You hold back words, opinions, jokes, desires. You edit your thoughts before they reach your tongue. This internal censorship becomes so seamless you may not notice it is happening. You simply feel less like talking. The vibrant internal monologue grows quiet. This silence is often misinterpreted as contemplation or calm. It is frequently the sound of the self, conserving what little energy it has left, retreating from a battlefield it never agreed to fight on. Awareness of these signs is not a call to action. It is simply a form of recognition. It is the last exit before the lock-in stage. Though it does not look like a brightly lit door, it feels more like a slight chill, a prickle of consciousness, a sudden clear moment where you perceive the gap between who you are and who you are becoming. This moment is often fleeting. The conditioned mind will rush to explain it away, to blame stress, fatigue, or your own inadequacy. This awareness is the faint signal from a deeper, less conditioned layer of the self. It is the part that has not yet adapted. It does not speak in words, but in sensations, a tightness in the chest, a sense of vague mourning for no clear reason, a feeling of watching yourself from a slight distance. These are not symptoms of illness. They are the indicators of a psychological immune system, registering a foreign presence, a slow change in the internal atmosphere. To notice is not to solve. It is simply to see the water you are in. That alone changes your relationship to it. The softening requires a passive participant, one who believes the changes are inherent to life itself. The simple, quiet act of observation, of noting the numbness, the cost-benefit analysis behind a yes, the strategic silence, breaks that passivity. It creates a tiny critical gap between the stimulus and the response. In that gap, a different choice can exist, not a dramatic rebellion, but a simple internal reclamation of note-taking. The process depends on your inattention to itself. It thrives in the unexamined life. The mere act of turning a calm, non-judgmental focus toward these subtle shifts alters their chemistry. It is the difference between a room slowly darkening and someone noticing the dial on the dimmer switch is being turned. The darkness is the same, but the understanding of its source changes everything. You may not be able to stop the hand on the dial, not yet, but you can, in the growing dim, choose to remember what the light once looked like. That memory itself is a form of resistance, It is a point of orientation. A north star in a sky that is being carefully, methodically clouded over. The softening is a process that happens to you. Awareness is the solitary, quiet process that happens within you. And in that space, no matter how small, something remains unsoftened. Chapter 14. Reversing the damage. The most disorienting phase is not the captivity itself, but the first moments of genuine freedom. The walls once felt as constant pressure are gone, yet the mind continues to lean against them. The old constraints have been internalized. They now exist as phantom boundaries, as muscles that have atrophied in a specific shape. To reverse the damage is not to simply walk away. It is to undergo a meticulous, often painful, process of neurological and psychological recalibration. The self must be rebuilt from the inside, using materials that feel unfamiliar, and a blueprint it must decipher from scars. This reversal begins with a fundamental recalibration of discomfort. For a long time, the signal of a healthy boundary, the sharp, clean feeling of no, was systematically pathologized. It was framed as conflict, as rudeness, as a problem to be smoothed over. The first step back is the re-recognition of that signal not as a flaw, but as essential data. It is the immune system of the self. Its return is not comfortable. It feels like inflammation. A long-dormant nerve firing back to life sends waves of pain. This pain is not a sign of something wrong. It is a sign of something waking up. The mechanism is neuroplasticity in reverse. Pathways that were strengthened through repetition, pathways of compliance, of seeking external validation, of silencing dissent, must now be allowed to weaken from disuse. New pathways must be forged. This requires conscious, repeated action that feels alien, even foolish. It is the biological basis of rebuilding resistance. Each time a boundary is stated and maintained, however clumsily, it is not just a social act. It is a neurological event. It is the slow, deliberate forging of a new circuit where one had been dismantled. This rebuilding feels less like strength and more like rigidity at first. A hardened boundary in the early stages lacks flexibility. It may be applied clumsily in situations that do not warrant its full force. This is not a failure. It is the necessary overcorrection of a system learning its parameters again. The mind is relearning the geography of the self, and it will make mistakes. It will map a gentle hill as a mountain for a time. This emotional and behavioral discipline is not about punishment. It is about the restoration of a functioning feedback loop between action, consequence, and internal peace. Agency returns in flickers, not in a flood. It appears in the small, silent space between a stimulus and your response. That space, once eradicated by conditioning, begins to widen. You notice the old script rising to your lips, the apologetic tone, the automatic agreement, the seeking glance for permission, and you pause. It asks you to furnish it with a choice that is truly your own. Observe it in the simple act of expressing a preference that holds no weight. Choosing the restaurant, the film, the route home, and sitting with the minor anxiety of that choice without immediately offering to change it. The conditioned mind screams that this is selfish, risky, insignificant. The recovering mind learns that this is how agency is practiced, in small, low-stakes rehearsals. Each one is a faint pulse in a dormant limb. Emotional discipline is the quiet defense. It is the practice of feeling an emotion, anger, sadness, longing, without immediately seeking to discharge it, explain it, or translate it for another's comfort. It is allowing the emotion to exist as a private, valid fact. This cuts the tether that once sent your emotional state out for external regulation and approval. It is a reclaiming of your inner atmosphere. The consequence is a growing stability that is not dependent on the mood of another. This feels lonely before it feels powerful. Thinking independently is a painful reactivation. It requires tolerating uncertainty, holding multiple perspectives without rushing to a consensus, and enduring the anxiety of not having the correct opinion validated. The mind, used to the dopamine hit of external approval or the relief of an adopted stance, will rebel. It will beg for the simplicity of the old paradigm. Independent thought is metabolically expensive. It is cognitively taxing. This is why it was surrendered in the first place. To take it up again is to choose the exhaustion of integrity over the ease of coherence. The psychological consequence of this reversal is a period of profound grief and dissonance. You grieve for the time lost, for the simpler, more approved of self you once presented. You face the dissonance between who you were becoming and who you now intend to be. The old conditioning will echo, a siren song promising ease and belonging. The new resistance will feel crude, awkward, and isolating. This is the authentic process. There is no bypass. The damage was done in layers. Over time, its undoing follows the same pattern. This is not a return to a former self. That self is gone, shaped by the experience of its own softening. The goal is integration, not erasure. The new boundaries will incorporate the knowledge of how they were once dissolved. The new agency will be aware of its own vulnerabilities. The rebuilt self is not a fortress of naive defiance. It is a watchful, respectful sovereignty. Its borders clearly marked not out of fear, but from a quiet, hard-won understanding of what it costs to lose them. The journey back is marked by a single, recurring realization that the deepest chains were made of your own thoughts, bent into shape by a persistent, unseen hand. And the final quiet revolution is the act of thinking them straight again, one stubborn, unapproved thought at a time. The end. Control dies when seen. There is a moment when the mechanism clicks into focus. The gentle pressures, the softened edges, the quiet accommodations. They suddenly arrange themselves into a recognizable shape. That shape has a purpose. In the moment of seeing it, a fundamental shift occurs. The process is no longer something happening to you. It is something you are observing. This is what power fears most. The calm, unblinking gaze of a mind that has recognized the machinery. Control depends on operating beneath the threshold of perception. When dragged into the light, its gears grind to a halt. It requires the complicity of your unconsciousness. Consciousness is a form of friction. The automated response meets a moment of hesitation. The absorbed narrative meets a quiet question. This friction generates heat. It is uncomfortable. This is why so many choose comfort over consciousness. Comfort is the warm bath of accepted reality, where the water has slowly been cooled by degrees you agreed to. Consciousness is the sudden, chilling awareness of the temperature and of the hand on the thermostat. To become conscious is to accept a permanent state of mild discomfort, the price of seeing the world as it is, not as it is presented. The price of staying asleep is the gradual forfeiture of a life, not in a single transaction, but in 10,000 tiny deductions. It is the slow replacement of your wants with adapted preferences. It is the quiet acceptance of a smaller world, a quieter voice, a dimmer spirit. You pay with pieces of yourself so small, you never feel the loss, only a growing lightness that you mistake for unburdening. It is the most expensive purchase you will ever make, and you will never receive a bill. The receipt is written in the language of your regrets, years later, for things you never quite did, words you never quite said, feelings you never quite allowed. Once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The patterns replicate everywhere. In the office, the family, the culture. You will notice the softening in others, the way they rationalize, the way they shrink, the grateful relief with which they accept a simpler sanctioned version of themselves. This sight is isolating. It can feel like a curse. You will be tempted to retreat back into the blur, to unlearn what you now know. This is not possible. Awareness, once activated, is a one-way journey. You can ignore its signals, but you cannot silence its presence. It becomes a silent partner in all your interactions. This understanding explains why good people comply with evil. It is rarely a choice between clear good and clear evil. It is a slow walk down a path where the signposts are gradually changed. Morality is not a fortress that is stormed. It is a territory that is negotiated, landmark by landmark, until the moral compass is pointing to a new north. Under prolonged atmospheric pressure, the human spirit seeks resolution. Aligning with the prevailing force is a resolution. It restores cognitive peace. The moral failure is not a moment of weakness, but the cumulative effect of 1,000 surrenders to social, emotional, or survival pressure. The conscience is not overcome. It is exhausted and then enlisted to justify its own exhaustion. Awareness is rare because it is metabolically costly and socially disruptive. It requires the energy to sustain doubt in a world that rewards certainty. It demands the courage to bear isolation in a species wired for belonging. The mind will, by default, choose the coherent narrative over the fractured truth, the warm lie over the cold fact. Most will reject these observations not because they are false, but because they are inconvenient. To accept them is to acknowledge a vulnerability in oneself and an unsettling reality about the world. It is easier to dismiss the observer as cynical, as paranoid, as seeing patterns where none exist. The rejection is a form of self-protection. It is the immune system of a worldview attacking a foreign agent. This knowledge is not neutral. It is a tool, and like any tool, its morality depends on the hand that holds it. It can protect or corrupt with equal efficiency. Understanding the mechanics of softening does not make you immune. It can make you more susceptible. If you begin to believe you are now the mechanic and not the material, it can become a manual for the very control it describes. This is the final and most important warning. Power always seeks the unaware. It flows into silence and thrives in darkness. Your awareness is therefore not just a personal state. It is a political act. It is a denial of resources to the mechanics of control. But be cautious. This knowledge can harden you in ways that make you brittle. It can tempt you to see engines of manipulation where there is only human clumsiness. The goal is not suspicion, but clarity. Not cynicism, but discernment. You have been briefed on the unspoken mechanics. The transmission is complete. This understanding now lives within you, a silent lens through which the world will forever be slightly irrevocably different. The choice of what to do with this sight, to harden into a fortress, to retreat into willful blindness, or to walk through the world with clear, calm eyes, is yours alone. Power will continue its work. It will always prefer the soft target. You now have a simple, profound, and burdensome advantage. You know what one looks like. The final question is not whether you will see the mechanisms around you. It is whether you will have the courage to acknowledge what you see in the mirror. The faint traces of softness, the gentle leans toward compliance, the quiet, human hunger for a comfort that has always been the opening bid. The control dies when seen. But first, you must be willing to look.